I know you guys are interested in sort of writing for the public good and sort of understanding how you could develop an open access policy, or share your work under Creative Commons licenses, and also advocate to others that you're possibly collaborating with to do the same, or to collaborate under an open licensing policy. And we have Creative Commons has some experience in advocating for this. We work a lot with various government agencies, and also in the philanthropic sector. So groups like I mentioned, like the Hewlett Foundation or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that spend a lot of money on creating digital materials for the public good, because that's what their charities are all about these days. So, and our conversations, I think, have a similar approach, whether we're talking with government agencies or whether we're talking with like philanthropies. But I think some of that can be useful in your sort of context as well. And the thing that we always like to start with, when we're talking about whether a particular group would like to adopt an open access policy for the writing that they're engaging in, is trying to get them aligned on like, what are their goals? So, what are the goals of like a government agency that's like say like the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, that spends somewhere north of $30 billion of public taxpayer dollars every year on scientific research? What are the goals of the National Institutes of Health, or like the Center for Disease Control, or other sorts of like big pools of public funding to conduct scientific research? And what are the goals of like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation when they have somewhere around $900 million of money that they're going to be spending on scientific research? And I think, we like to get them to talk about what their goals are in terms of, what do you want to see come out of this money? What is the purpose of spending this money? And, when they get talking about it, they really talk about it in terms of, we want to see the maximum impact on our research dollars. We want to be supporting pure science. We want to be supporting an increase of knowledge around the world. We want to be supporting, faster discoveries of cures for diseases, those sorts of things. And it's really important, as you're thinking about possibly developing an open access policy or working with partners, to try to come upon like, what are our goals? What do we want to get out of our writing? Because I think sometimes those things aren't observable, and they're not sort of common knowledge until you start talking about it. So, we ask the question, like, do we actually agree when we're talking about like what open access means or what open means? And sometimes we do agree, sometimes we don't. And there's this interesting quote from this guy I know, Tom Lee, who describes sort of like Creative Commons and open access and open licensing in a really good way. He said, open access and Creative Commons is about giving up a little bit of control so that other people can benefit. And I think that's a really good way of sort of synthesizing Creative Commons and our approach to copyright. It's about giving up a little bit of control so that other people can use your works, so that other people can kind of incorporate, can read, can reuse works for their benefit. And I think this really overlaps a lot with writing sort of in the public good. So, we try to get organizations to think about some of these questions, to ask these questions. Are you talking about public access to publicly funded materials? Is your goal broad dissemination or use? Or is your goal something else? Are you trying to run a business? Are you trying to do like a writing startup? Are you trying to recuperate costs that you're putting into it? Because those questions, the answer to those questions affect how you're going to develop your policy and what sort of licensing conditions, what Creative Commons license you're going to choose for your project. But it's very important to put these sort of things on the table at the beginning of the process, because I think it helps smooth out problems down the road. So we try to get these organizations and government agencies to state like what's important to them and why it's important to them. And I'll just take a brief detour here about some of the foundations we worked with that have actually implemented open licensing policies within their foundations have actually done this. So say this is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have adopted a very liberal open licensing policy for the scientific research that they're funding. So they have their policy up and running now, and they actually have statements from their top people. Trevor Mundell, he used to be the head of their global health initiative, writing publicly about why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing this, and writing it in public so that everyone sort of understands what are the motivations behind our organization doing this. It's clear to the public, it's clear to the researchers that are going to be applying for money, and it's also clear to the people working inside the foundation to hear from the top sort of executives why this is an important thing that our foundation is going to be doing. The Hewlett Foundation has done the same thing, explained, adopting an open licensing policy is going to help our good ideas go further. And they've developed this blog post and written about it. And if you look at other places like the Wikimedia Foundation, this is the group that runs Wikipedia. They also do a lot of scientific research around their platform. Everything that they produce is licensed under Creative Commons license as well, and they have explanations of why they're doing it. So all of this is just to say it's important to be very clear about this with the public and internally with the other people that are working on the project sort of with you. So the goals is the first thing, and sort of making those clear. Another thing that we talk about when we talk with governments, foundations, and others looking to adopt an open licensing policy is what sorts of content are you talking about? Are you going to be funding scientific research? Is it going to be mostly sort of like sociological reports? Is it going to be educational content like instructional videos or textbooks? Is it going to be photography? All these things you need to be thinking about, because the different types of content might require different solutions with regard to the process that's involved and also the license that you choose. So for example, if you're talking about creating open educational resources, the normative way to approach that is to use Creative Commons licenses, of course, but use licenses that don't have the clause that says you can't change it, because obviously you want teachers to be able to modify and adapt and update and customize digital education materials so that they're relevant for local communities. So, they use all the CC licenses except for the ones that don't permit, the creation of derivatives. But for open access research, they've sort of rallied around this very liberal license solution, which is the Creative Commons Attribution License, which means anyone can use it for any purpose, even commercially, as long as you give attribution to the author. And then for other types of content, you need to think differently. When we talk about things like creating and sharing data and data sets, we really advocate for people to utilize even our public domain tools. So CC0 is something that allows researchers to put data directly into the public domain, which means there's no rights reserved. Anyone can use it for whatever purpose, and it makes sharing and reuse, it lowers the barriers to sharing and reuse maximally. And we think this is really useful for data because it can be useful then to the widest number of people in the widest number of ways. And then, of course, you might think about other things that don't require CC licensing, or probably don't. If your open access project is going to be creating software, we recommend that you don't use CC licenses, because there are already a lot of different open access licenses, open software licenses out there produced by groups like the Free Software Foundation. So, all of these things, when we're talking about creating an open licensing policy, we need to talk about what types of content are you sort of producing. And then the final component is really getting buy-in from the various stakeholders that are going to be affected by the policy. You really need to, and we really advocate this when we talk with governments, when we talk with foundations, they need to be developing their policy with the people that are going to be affected by it. It's always nice to be able to do it that way rather than like, you sort of hear on Monday morning, well, from the top, we've got this new thing that we need to follow now. Like people don't appreciate that, they want to be looped into the process and they want to provide input to the process to be heard. And so there's a push for cooperation around actual development of the policy and implementation of the policy. In my experience, we've seen that leadership is really important. So, I was mentioning to John and Daniel when we talked a few weeks ago, I was involved in a project at University of Michigan to share all of our course content at the medical school. And it was great because we had advocates from the top of the medical school saying, this is important, we want to do it. But that's not enough. You need buy-in from the individual faculty that are going to be affected by this policy. So that requires, legwork, going around to people, talking with them, understanding what their concerns are, getting them on board. It needs to be a collaborative process and a cooperative process. So leadership from the top is important, but it's not everything. You need support from below. You need sort of that grassroots as well. Some things we actually talk about with governments and foundations as well is, it doesn't need to be like revolutionary overnight. You can start small, experiment with like a particular part of your portfolio. Maybe there's a small pool of money around a particular scientific discipline, where it's really right for an open access policy, or like the researchers involved there are really open to sharing. Why not try an open licensing policy there first before you try to extend it to other areas that might have more pushback, and sort of test it and refine it. So sort of start small and experiment in that way. The Hewlett Foundation did this. They started only with their education program, and then eventually they moved their open licensing policy so it covers all of the foundation. In terms of buy-in, it's useful to, some examples from the university side that we recognize is, there's an open access policy that's developed by people within the university and executives within the university, but then it actually requires like a vote, a vote from the faculty about whether they're going to adopt this or not. And these measures are incredibly important. And of course, it changes from university to university. But getting that buy-in is really important. But to have a faculty senate vote on whether we're going to adopt an open licensing policy is really important when you're talking about instituting at places like Harvard and University of California. A few final things. Of course, it's useful to have a few safety valves here or there. So, we advocate for organizations to adopt the default open licensing policy. So, an open licensing policy that will cover everything. But of course, sometimes it can't cover everything. There might be specific things that need to be carved out. So for example, I remember one grantee program that was funded from the Open Society Foundations funded a documentary film program. And this documentary film program pulled in different pieces of film from sort of popular media and television, which couldn't be licensed under a Creative Commons license, because it would just been too difficult to get the permission to do that. So, that particular documentary film was carved out of the policy, even though it covered the rest of the grantees. So it's important to have a little bit of a flexibility and some of those safety valves, because we obviously realize there's going to be exceptions to sort of every licensing rule. Another thing that's important is to try to develop, for the grantees to develop, like how are we going to measure whether this policy is impactful or not? So, and how are we going to measure whether people are following it or are complying with it? That's actually very important. And then finally, like I mentioned before, it's sort of important to reinforce to the public and to your staff and to the stakeholders why this is important. Like, why are we doing this? And actually bring that up from time to time and re-examine some of your notions from time to time to sort of realize whether we're still on the same page or whether the policy needs to be changed or adapted a bit.